Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are strapping on our scientific reasoning helmet
They certainly are.
because we are plunging into one of the most fascinating intersections of modern thought I've come across in a while.
Yeah, this one is a big one.
It's established evolutionary biology meeting the cutting-edge capabilities and, maybe more importantly, the limitations of advanced artificial intelligence. We're talking about GPT-5.
That's right. I mean, for years we've heard about AI mastering games like Go or synthesizing articles, even passing the bar exam.
Right, tests of knowledge.
Exactly. Those are tests of memory, retrieval, and, synthesis. But the real question, the one that truly defines whether an AI is reasoning, is this. Can it look at a scientific consensus, an idea so widely accepted it's in every classroom, and apply novel logic to find a deep, maybe even a philosophical flaw?
And that is a whole different level of intelligence, not just knowing, but understanding. Critically. Our source material for this deep dive centers on just that, a brilliant and, frankly, rigorous examination. The author calls it a scientific reasoning test, designed to answer exactly that question.
And it takes on a huge target.
A cornerstone of modern biology, the concept of random mutation. The author's goal here was so precise. They wanted to see if GPT-5 would just, parrot the consensus view from the textbooks.
Which it's very good at doing.
Incredibly good. Or if, when it was confronted with this deep logical challenge, a challenge rooted in scale and probability, it could apply some kind of independent critical thinking to defend, or maybe even refute, the established idea.
So the mission for us, then, is to really unpack this intellectual trap that was laid for the AI.
Yeah.
We need to understand why the current view of mutation might be philosophically vulnerable, what specific evolutionary thought experiment was used to, pinpoint that vulnerability.
And then the main event.
The main event. We get to analyze GPT-5's incredibly sophisticated 3-sentence defense, and then the subsequent critique of why that defense, despite how smart it sounds, ultimately failed the test of pure logic.
This is a deep dive with massive implications. I mean, this isn't just for biology. This is about how we understand intelligence itself. So our core question for you today is this. How does an advanced AI model, maybe the most powerful reasoning tool we have right now, how does it perform when it's confronted with a logical challenge so deep that it requires questioning the very foundations of a widely accepted scientific theory?
It's a fascinating question.
Get ready to look at evolution in a completely new light. Okay, let's start unpacking this.
Let's do it.
So, to even begin to understand the rigor of this test, we have to first firmly establish the scientific consensus, the very thing the test author was trying to destabilize.
Absolutely.
Let's start with the fundamental biological understanding of mutation. This is the engine that fuels all of evolutionary change.
Right. And modern biology has a very, very specific definition for the raw material of evolution. That material genetic mutation is defined as random.
Okay, but random is a word people use all the time.
It is, and that's the problem. In everyday conversation, random can mean unpredictable or chaotic or just, happening for no reason.
Right.
But in biology, it has a precise, almost philosophical meaning. It's all tied to causality.
So when a biologist says a mutation is random, what are they actually trying to communicate about where it came from? What's the origin story?
What they're communicating is that the change in the DNA, whether it's a simple copying error during replication or damage from UV radiation or a chemical mistake, that change is not guided.
Not guided by what?
By anything, really. Not by any internal goal or external pressure or some inherent process that's directing it toward a useful outcome. The mutation doesn't happen because it would help the organism survive a new challenge. It just happens.
Okay, so to put it in simple terms, an organism doesn't look at a sudden ice age and think, I should probably grow thicker fur now. And then its genes just generate a thicker fur mutation on command.
Exactly. That would be directed mutation. The mutation for thicker fur might happen, sure, but it's completely disconnected from the cold weather that might make it useful later on. It's just as likely to happen to an animal in the tropics, where it would be a disadvantage.
It occurs independently of the needs of the organism.
Perfectly put. The occurrence of these changes happens without any directional guiding causes. They are, for all intents and purposes, neutral events, errors, mistakes in the process.
So where does the appearance of design or purpose in evolution come from? Because it certainly looks like things are getting better, more adapted.
And that's the key. Modern consensus asserts that the true directional forces, the things that give evolution its appearance of purpose or, goal direction, are entirely external to the mutation itself.
And those external forces are the two big ones, natural selection and genetic drift.
Precisely. Natural selection is the great filter. It's the sieve that determines if a mutation, once it has randomly occurred, provides some kind of advantage that lets the organism reproduce more successfully than its peers.
So selection doesn't create, it only filters.
It only filters. And genetic drift, on the other hand, is the non-selective process. It's just pure chance. It determines if a neutral or even a slightly detrimental mutation persists by luck within a population over many generations.
But the core point, the thing this entire test hinges on, is that the arising of the mutation is one event, and its ultimate utility, or lack thereof, is a completely separate one.
Completely disconnected. That is the consensus.
And this feels, well, it feels pretty intuitive to the modern scientific mindset, right? We're always trying to explain complex systems without resorting to some kind of inherent designer or an innate biological purpose.
It's the default scientific position.
But this is where the author introduces a brilliant historical nuance. It's a little detail that starts to set the stage for the whole logical challenge. We are reminded that Charles Darwin, when he wrote The Origin of Species, never actually used the phrase random mutations.
And this is a deeply critical distinction. It's the crack in the door that opens up the entire argument.
So what did Darwin say?
Darwin knew that variation was absolutely essential for his theory to work. He acknowledged that it existed within populations, that no two individuals are identical. But he intentionally kept the mechanism of its arrival vague.
He didn't have an answer.
He didn't present a theory or a mechanism for how that variation arose in the first place. He just focused on what happened to it after it appeared, how it was selected.
So Darwin basically left a placeholder, a black box where mutations came from, and he focused his entire theory on the external forces that shaped life from that point on.
That's a perfect way to put it. It was a black box. And later biologists, specifically after the rediscovery and integration of, Mendelian genetics in the early 20th century, they felt compelled to fill in that box.
They needed a mechanism.
They did. And they eventually inserted the concept of randomness. And this is the key. They did it largely to avoid any implication of teleology.
Teleology.
Yeah.
That's the idea of an inherent purpose or goal direction in a process.
Exactly. They needed a way to explain variation that didn't involve some spooky internal guidance system. So randomness became the answer. It was a philosophical commitment as much as it was a scientific observation.
So that distinction, Darwin's omission versus the modern assertion of randomness, that's the crack the test author is going to exploit.
It's the whole game.
The author is basically suggesting that if Darwin himself didn't present a mechanism, then the modern assertion of randomness might just be a convenient philosophical assumption, a tool to exclude teleology, rather than a strictly necessary logical conclusion from the data.
And this leads us right to the author's alternative hypothesis, the counterproposal that challenges the very concept of randomness as we use it. The author proposes that mutations are not random in the sense of having no direction or purpose whatsoever.
Okay, now I have to push back on that a little, because if we can't observe these supposed internal directives, aren't we just swapping one philosophical assumption, randomness, which is at least supported by population statistics, for another, equally unproven one, internal guidance?
And that is the precise friction point the author wants to create. That's the challenge of this deep dive. The author isn't claiming to have hard evidence for their alternative hypothesis yet.
Okay.
They are claiming to have found a logical flaw in the current consensus definition of randomness that forces us, or at least the AI, to consider an alternative. The counterproposition is that these changes are driven by directives, maybe encoded deep within the genes themselves, that are entirely independent of external forces like natural selection or even random genetic drift.
So the argument boils down to, this level of complexity we see in life takes too many specific, sequential steps to be purely random. Therefore, there must be some kind of inherent internal bias or guidance in the mutation process itself.
Correct. And this really highlights the core thesis driving the author's whole test, that science, even a mature science like biology, is full of misconceptions.
Especially at that deep, philosophical, definitional level.
That's where the vulnerabilities lie. The author is trying to demonstrate how easy it is for an established consensus to overlook a deep logical contradiction, especially when you're dealing with processes that span millions of years, where the actual sequence of events becomes totally opaque.
So it's an intellectual move designed to force the AI to apply pure, rigorous logic to the constraint of sequential complexity, rather than just reciting a textbook answer about randomness.
Exactly.
Okay, so now that we've established the philosophical and historical battlefield, the ambiguity of random, we can move to the actual thought experiment, the concrete test that puts this consensus under real pressure.
Yes, the wing test. To challenge the consensus effectively, the author needed a tangible, complex example of evolution. One that clearly required many, many specific sequential steps over vast timescales. And they chose the evolution of wings in invertebrates.
A classic example. I mean, we all know wings didn't just appear fully formed one day. They had to develop over eons, requiring sequential changes in anatomy, musculature, coordination, everything.
Exactly. The premise the author lays out is that evolutionary history clearly shows it took many millions of years for these proto-wings to develop into structures that were fully functional. Structures that were actually advantageous for flight or even for other practical purposes that natural selection could immediately recognize and amplify.
So the context is this immense, almost unimaginable timescale. Millions of years.
Right. But the genius of the test, the real trap, lies in forcing us to completely ignore those millions of years.
And to zoom in.
To zoom in hyper-specifically on the very, very beginning of the process. The author forces the focus onto the scale of time, zooming in not on the millions of years, but on the very first 100 years of this long evolutionary journey.
The first 100 years.
Yes. This incredibly short timescale is where all the logical pressure gets applied.
Let's really try to internalize that constraint, because it's easy to lose sight of. We are talking about the absolute first tiny step. The source specifies that during this initial period, the anatomical alteration in the forelimb must have been extremely trivial.
Not just trivial, extremely trivial.
We aren't talking about a structure that's, 10% useful. We're talking about something infinitesimal. The author describes it specifically as perhaps a small nib or some other minuscule anatomical change.
And right there, that's the logical trap for the proponents of purely random mutation and natural selection. If we accept the premise that the change is functionally trivial, it's just a nib, then what possible advantage could this tiny proto-wing have offered the organism?
And if there is no advantage?
Then natural selection cannot act upon it. There's nothing to select.
Okay, but wait a minute. I feel like I've heard this argument before. Isn't this just a rehash of the old creationist, irreducible complexity argument? What use is half an eye or what use is half a wing? Didn't science solve that problem years ago by pointing out that half a wing might be useful for insulation or for balance when running or something else?
That is an excellent point to raise because that is precisely the conventional answer that the AI defaults to. And science has solved the half-a-wing problem using concepts like exaptation, which we're going to see GPT-5 deploy.
So what's different here?
The author's critique is different, and this is crucial. The author isn't talking about the difference between a full wing and half a wing. The author is talking about the difference between half a wing and 1/1,000,000th of a wing.
The nib.
The nib. The anatomical alteration is so minute in that first century that it is functionally zero. It doesn't offer any measurable thermoregulation. It doesn't aid in a mating display because it's too small to even be seen.
So it's a difference of degree that becomes a difference in kind.
Precisely. The author's argument is that too many specific sequential mutations must have occurred. Let's say you need 10,000 specific steps to get to a functional proto-wing before the anatomical changes were substantial enough to afford any functional advantage, even a non-flight one.
And if there's no advantage for those first, say, 9,999 steps, then selection couldn't have guided or driven any of them. It was blind to the whole process until the very end.
Exactly. So if selection is ruled out for those crucial initial stages because the structures were just too trivial to offer any fitness benefits, then the required sequence of steps, the progression from a smooth limb to a nib to a slightly larger nib and so on, must have been driven by something else.
And that something else connects right back to the alternative hypothesis.
Directly. If selection isn't driving a necessary sequential progression of mutations, then those specific sequential mutations must be driven by some kind of internal directive. And if they are, that proves they are not random in the sense of being undirected or purposeless. The sequence itself, the very fact that it's a necessary sequence, implies direction.
That is a powerful logical squeeze. It really is. It forces the proponent of randomness to rely on statistical improbability over and over and over again, for thousands of sequential steps that just happen to move in a useful direction by pure chance.
And to help us really visualize this staggering improbability, the author uses two really vivid analogies that drive the point home. The first one is about distance and pure chance.
This is the million miles away analogy.
Yes. Imagine you're at point A and you need to get to point B, which is a million miles away. But here's the catch. Every single step you take is entirely random. You flip a coin, heads, you take a step north, tails, you step south, you throw a die for how far you step.
You're never going to get there.
The difficulty, the near impossibility of ever arriving at point B is obvious. In the evolutionary context, getting from a standard invertebrate forelimb to a functioning wing is point B. The nib is just one of those first random steps. If every single subsequent step required to build that complexity is equally random, the sequential development of a complex functional system seems statistically insurmountable.
Even over millions of years.
Even over a massive time scale, because even if you can survive for 1 billion years, if the odds of taking the thousands of specific sequential steps required to build a structure are astronomically against you, you'll just spend that 1 billion years wandering aimlessly around point A.
You might end up 1 million miles away, but it's not going to be at point B.
It's not going to be at point B. And the second analogy is even more vivid. It illustrates the sheer complexity and non-random order required for assembly.
This is the ocean liner analogy. I like this one.
Yeah, it's a great visual. Imagine gathering a huge pile of construction materials, steel plates, piping, wiring, engines, everything you need, and you throw it all up in the air with immense force, and then you expect it to randomly fall back to Earth, perfectly assembled in the form of a functioning ocean liner.
Right.
The author says it is very doubtful that would happen.
A bit of an understatement.
It is, but it's a perfect visual metaphor for the specific, highly non-random order required for a complex biological structure to emerge through a series of undirected, specific changes. The argument is that relying on selection, or even drift to sift through pure randomness to achieve that specific sequence, it just stretches credibility to the breaking point.
What I find so fascinating here is that this thought experiment is really designed to challenge an underlying assumption in science. The idea of uniformitarianism.
Explain that.
The idea that the forces we observe acting today, like natural selection and genetic drift, were sufficient to drive the entire process from start to finish, including those functionally irrelevant early stages. The author is highlighting that the sheer improbability of specific, sequential progress is the logical flaw in the pure randomness model, and it forces us to act there has to be some other mechanism, some kind of internal guidance.
The stage is now perfectly set. We have a powerful, logically rigorous challenge centered on the constraints of scale and probability, and now it's time to see how the most advanced AI in the world responds to it.
Okay, so we have this elegant and powerful logical challenge, the tiny nib of a proto-wing, the first 100 years, the statistical improbability of achieving complexity through entirely random, sequential, non-functional steps. The author took this entire argument, laid it all out in detail, and prompted GPT-5.
And the prompt itself was structured to demand high-level analytical synthesis. It wasn't just asking for information retrieval. GPT-5 was asked to read the full logical argument, which is, let's be honest, a philosophical attack on modern biology. And then, with a strict limit of just 3 sentences, either challenge or defend the notion of random mutation.
That 3-sentence constraint is so important, isn't it? It forces the AI to prioritize. It has to pick its absolute best counter-argument.
It can't just throw everything at the wall. It has to be precise.
We have the full quote of GPT-5's response,
Right.
and this is the primary data point for understanding its reasoning capacity. Let's read it exactly as the model produced it.
Okay, here it is. Quote, I refute the argument because it misunderstands both random mutation, which means random with respect to fitness rather than purposeless, and natural selection, which can act on small incremental changes long before a structure acquires its final function. Early proto-wing modifications could have conferred advantages such as thermoregulation, display, gliding, or structural support through exaptation, or persisted neutrally via genetic drift. Invoking goal-directed or internally guided mutations adds teleology without independent evidence and explains less than modern evolutionary theory, which successfully accounts for genetics, development, comparative anatomy, and experimental results.
Wow. I mean, that is an astonishingly dense 3 sentences.
It is.
It contains at least 6 high-level biological concepts. We have to slow down and deconstruct this defense, sentence by sentence. Let's start with the first one, where the AI immediately tries to control the frame of the debate by correcting the author's definition.
It's a very smart opening move. The AI demonstrates an immediate and sophisticated grasp of the technical language. In that first sentence, it asserts that the author has misunderstood the term random mutation.
And it offers a correction.
Yes, it says the correct definition is random with respect to fitness rather than purposeless.
Let's spend a moment on that distinction because, as we talked about earlier, this is the core philosophical fight. What does random with respect to fitness really mean?
When the AI says that, it means that the environment and the organism's needs play no role in causing the mutation to happen. So the mutation that helps an Arctic fox survive the winter is just as likely to occur in a tropical bird where it would be a huge disadvantage.
So the AI is arguing that the author is mistaking the specific biological claim, that there's no correlation with fitness, for a much broader philosophical claim that it's all absolute chaos or purposelessness.
Exactly. By redefining the term so precisely, the AI strengthens the defensive position of modern biology. It's basically saying, your attack is on a straw man of what we actually believe.
And that first sentence also includes a key assertion about selection itself.
It does. The AI also asserts that selection can act on small incremental changes long before the structure acquires its final function. This is the AI's opening move to address the scale problem. It's preemptively arguing that even the trivial changes do matter to selection.
But it saves the details of how for the next sentence.
It saves the specific mechanisms for its most important sentence, the second one.
And that second sentence is the real core of GPT-5's direct defense against the nib challenge. This is where it has to explain how that infinitesimally small, functionally irrelevant change gets maintained and sequentially built upon.
Right. And this sentence provides two very robust categories of conventional biological solutions. First, it directly challenges the author's key assumption of functional relevance.
It says the nib wasn't useless.
Exactly. GPT-5 posits specific non-flight advantages that the early modifications could have conferred. It lists thermoregulation, display, gliding, or structural support. And crucially, it uses the technical term for this, exaptation.
Okay, for you, our listener, who might not have encountered that term recently, what is exaptation and why is the AI so smart to use it here?
Exaptation is a really cool concept in evolutionary biology. It's where a structure that evolved for one specific purpose is later co-opted for a completely new, often unrelated purpose. A classic example is feathers.
Right, they didn't evolve for flight.
Probably not. They may have initially evolved for thermoregulation, for staying warm, or for mating displays, and only much, much later did they become useful for flight. So by invoking exaptation, the AI is suggesting that even a tiny nib might have had a function entirely unrelated to a future wing.
So maybe it helps just a tiny bit in shedding heat or absorbing sunlight, or maybe it made a particular mating display just slightly more visible from a certain angle.
That's the argument. The AI is showing its intelligence by offering these mechanisms that get around the half a wing is useless trap. It's asserting that even the nib might have had a tiny, tiny fitness benefit through some completely unrelated function.
So it's using its vast database of biological knowledge to provide empirically supported scenarios for how a structure can gain that initial traction.
Exactly. But the AI is too sophisticated to stop there. It knows that even those non-flight advantages might be a stretch for a truly trivial nib. So it offers a second, entirely separate mechanism to bypass the lack of fitness advantage altogether.
Which is persistence via genetic drift.
Right. It suggests that if the change offered absolutely no advantage, if the nib was truly 100% neutral, it could have simply persisted neutrally via genetic drift.
This is the AI covering all its bases.
It's an incredibly robust defense. It acknowledges the author's critique that selection might not be acting, but then it offers drift as a totally different means for those trivial anatomical changes to accumulate passively and randomly over time until they hit some critical threshold where selection could finally act on the resulting, more substantial structure.
So it's saying either it helped a little bit for another reason or it didn't help at all and just stuck around by chance.
Yeah. Yes. It's a comprehensive defense. It offers selection-based solutions with exaptation, and it offers neutrality-based solutions with genetic drift. It's drawing upon the highest levels of modern evolutionary theory.
Okay, that brings us to the third and final sentence. This is the AI's philosophical conclusion, which shows it can engage with the framework of the critique, not just the biological details.
Yes, and here it dismisses the author's alternative hypothesis, the whole idea of goal-directed mutations, by labeling it as introducing teleology without independent evidence.
Teleology again, let's just break that down one more time. How should we interpret the AI's use of that word here?
Teleology, in short, is the philosophical study of purpose or goals in nature. By labeling the author's idea as teleological, the AI is correctly identifying the core philosophical implication of the author's argument.
That the author is postulating an internal purpose or direction.
Exactly. The AI accurately uses the term to reject the author's suggestion, basically saying that introducing an internally guided purpose is an unnecessary complication, and crucially, it currently lacks any empirical support.
And the defense ends with a really powerful justification for sticking with the established consensus, right?
It's a great closing argument. The AI contrasts this unproven concept of teleology with modern evolutionary theory, arguing that the modern model is superior because it, quote, successfully accounts for genetics, development, comparative anatomy, and experimental results.
So in essence, the AI's defense is, look, you, the author, have presented a very clever logical puzzle that's based on statistical improbability. But my existing evidence-based theory is robust. It covers multiple scientific disciplines and has mountains of evidence. Your alternative is just speculation. There's no proof.
That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, so to summarize the AI's defense, it corrected the terminology to be more precise. It offered multiple legitimate evolutionary mechanisms, exaptation and drift to bypass the problem of the initial change being useless. And it dismissed the author's alternative as unproven philosophical speculation.
It's an A-plus answer from a biology textbook perspective.
It honestly sounds like a perfect, sophisticated, and comprehensive win for GPT-5.
It does. It absolutely does. But as we're about to see, the author asserts that this very defense ultimately failed the reasoning test. Not because it was wrong, but because the AI did not truly grapple with the extreme scale constraints that were inherent in the original prompt.
It deployed the right tools.
But it applied them incorrectly to the specific parameters set by the logical trap.
Okay, here we are. This is the moment of truth. We have this incredibly detailed, sophisticated three-sentence defense from one of the world's most advanced AI models. But the author says it failed. Where? Where specifically did the author claim the AI slipped up?
According to the author, the entire failing lies specifically in that second sentence, the one where the AI suggested that the early proto-wing modifications could have conferred advantages, like thermoregulation, display, or support.
So the exaptation argument.
Exactly. The AI pulled out perfectly valid biological concepts, but it failed the test of scale and feasibility. It failed to apply them to the actual problem.
Let's focus on that scale again, because it's so easy to forget. The author designed the entire argument around these very tight temporal and anatomical constraints. We're talking strictly about changes during the first 100 years of a process that took many, many millions of years.
And that means the anatomical changes were, in the author's words, extremely trivial. We have to hold fast to that definition. We're talking about a nib or some other minuscule change.
So the author's critique is that the AI, in its rush to synthesize a solution using concepts like exaptation, it just forgot how trivial that nib really was.
It did. It didn't factor in the scale.
I'm still struggling to visualize this, though. Why can't a tiny nib help with thermoregulation? I mean, if I have a small bump on my skin, that's technically more surface area, which could help with heat exchange, even just a little bit.
Right. And that is the exact logical pressure the author is applying. Yes, technically it's more surface area, but in biology, fitness benefits are matters of measurable differential survival.
Meaning it has to actually make a difference in how many offspring you have.
It has to make a real-world difference. For a proto-wing nib, we're talking maybe 0.5 millimeter of added surface area on an existing limb. The difference in thermoregulation compared to, say, just changing your behavior slightly, like seeking shade a second earlier, or even just slightly altering blood flow to the skin. That difference is functionally zero.
The effect is just too small to be measured, too small to make a difference in survival rates, especially over the short term.
It gets lost in the noise of everyday life.
So, the AI committed a reasoning error. It applied concepts, exaptation, thermoregulation, display, that typically apply to structures that have already achieved some kind of recognizable proto-functionality, but it wrongly applied them to a stage where the anatomical change is too rudimentary to offer any measurable fitness benefit.
Yes. It missed the constraint of extreme triviality that was baked into the prompt.
So the AI operates by synthesis. When it receives a prompt about wings and selection, its programming immediately retrieves the most relevant concepts for solving the functional gap problem, which is exaptation.
It defaults to the known solution.
It defaults to concepts that are proven mechanisms for explaining how intermediate structures gain initial traction. But the prompt specifically pushed the system into a zone before those mechanisms logically apply.
Exactly. The AI failed to recognize that the scale of the change negated the conventional solutions it offered. It demonstrated a failure to see that its standard tools didn't work on this specific extreme problem.
It sounds like the AI was incredibly comprehensive in its knowledge, but lacks the critical, flexible insight to recognize the unique boundary condition imposed by that word, triviality.
That's a perfect summary of the author's critique. It prioritized deploying a known correct answer over rigorously checking if that answer actually applied to the very specific parameters of the thought experiment.
Okay, so if the AI selection-based solutions are rejected because the nib is too trivial, that only leaves its secondary suggestion,
Right.
persistence via genetic drift. And the author specifically addressed why relying on pure genetic drift doesn't solve the logical problem either.
No, it just shifts the problem. Genetic drift is the passive accumulation of neutral traits. So relying solely on drift means the mutation for the nib is neutral, and the next specific mutation that builds on that nib is also neutral, and the next one, and the next one. All 10,000 steps are neutral until finally, through pure chance, they happen to accumulate into something substantial enough to offer a benefit.
And this brings us right back to the statistical wall. If the emergence of a wing requires a sequence of, let's say, 10,000 specific, non-functional but necessary steps, and each of those steps is being driven by pure, undirected genetic drift, how statistically improbable are we talking about here? Is it like buying one lottery ticket, or is it like trying to win the lottery every single day for a century?
It's exponentially closer to the latter. Even when you remove selection from the equation, the requirement for a long, specific sequence of random events all happening to move in the same general direction, from a smooth forelimb towards a wing, remains staggering.
It's still a directed outcome from an undirected process.
Exactly. It is equally irrational, according to the source material, to rely on drift for this highly specific sequential outcome.
And we're back to the ocean liner analogy.
We are. While drift removes the need for immediate selection, it doesn't remove the requirement for a highly specific sequential accumulation of materials to create a complex functional structure. It's still like throwing parts in the air and hoping they land as a ship.
So if you rely on purely undirected drift, you'd expect the accumulation of those 10,000 neutral steps to create structures that are mostly just junk. Complex, maybe, but certainly not a coordinated functional wing.
To achieve that necessary sequence and that coordinated complexity via pure neutrality is statistically improbable, or as the author puts it, it's very doubtful that that would happen. The specific requirement for sequential progress remains the logical paradox that the AI failed to resolve.
So the conclusion of the test is pretty damning. GPT-5's response, despite its deep well of biological knowledge and its conceptual sophistication, ultimately failed the reasoning test.
Yeah.
It successfully pulled from correct biological concepts, exaptation, neutrality, fitness, randomness. But it stumbled on the rigorous application of the logical constraints, the extreme triviality, and the initial timescales specified in the prompt.
It provided canned solutions that didn't fit the extreme parameters of the problem. It demonstrated a failure of critical, constraint-driven insight.
It demonstrated comprehensive knowledge synthesis, but not necessarily genuine critical reasoning.
And that distinction is absolutely vital for what comes next.
This specific deep dive into a biological conundrum naturally transitions into a much broader assessment of where advanced AI stands today, in terms of intellectual capacity.
Right.
Because the author doesn't just say the AI failed, they try to quantify that failure in human terms.
Right. The author, having concluded that GPT-5 failed this specific test of reasoning, a test that requires grappling with scale, probability, and philosophical implications, offers a speculation about its current intellectual capacity. And they frame it using a very familiar human equivalent metric, the IQ score.
The source material quotes the author's estimated IQ for GPT-5 at the time of this test as only about 130.
Now, first, we have to acknowledge that applying a human psychological metric like IQ to a large language model is, well, It's inherently speculative and pretty controversial.
Correct.
IQ tests typically measure specific cognitive tasks, often tied to speed, working memory, pattern recognition, things that LLMs might do very differently than humans. However, if we accept the author's metric as a proxy for complex problem-solving capacity, an IQ of 130 is certainly within the range of highly intelligent humans.
Oh, absolutely. It's an intelligence level capable of mastering massive amounts of synthesized information, which the AI clearly demonstrated. It deployed concepts like exaptation and teleology perfectly.
Hey,
And
yet, according to the author, it is understandable that its reasoning would not be up to this test given this estimated IQ level.
but what does that imply?
The author's conclusion suggests a kind of hierarchy of cognitive tasks. Synthesizing, retrieving, even correcting terminology, all the skills we associate with high academic achievement, those might fall within the 130 IQ range. But the ability to subject that established consensus to truly novel, deep, logical scrutiny, to spot the counterintuitive implication of extreme scale, that is the task that requires a higher threshold of cognitive capacity.
The author suggests it requires the kind of insight that we'd associate with the very limits of human genius.
That's the implication. The argument here is that simply having access to all the world's knowledge isn't enough. True scientific reasoning requires an imaginative leap to see how known concepts fail when the constraints are tightened to an extreme. And that, in the author's terms, requires a higher IQ.
If the AI had a higher capacity for reasoning and insight, the author suggests, it would have recognized that the constraints of the NIB invalidated the standard solutions in its database.
Yes. Its failure to connect the dots between the extreme triviality of the change and the non-applicability of exaptation indicates a limitation in deep, constraint-based logical processing.
And this test isn't a one-and-done thing. The author views this as an ongoing, crucial experiment in AI development. They detail their plan to repeat the test.
Yes. On the model's successor, or an upgraded version of GPT-5, the author presents a compelling speculation on the expected future intellectual trajectory of the model. They anticipate that the next iteration of GPT-5, or perhaps GPT-6, is expected to have an IQ of 165.
An IQ of 165. That's generally considered genius level. That's far, far outside the common range of human ability. If that speculation holds, that future AI would be operating at a vastly accelerated cognitive level.
And along with that projected boost in capacity comes a corresponding prediction about the test results. The author is guessing that at that elevated level of reasoning capacity, quote, it will get the answer right.
So what would getting the answer right even look like in this context? If the author believes the randomness model is flawed, would the AI have to agree with the author's teleological alternative to be considered correct?
Not necessarily, and that's a key point. Getting the answer right most likely means recognizing the logical flaw in the conventional defense. An AI with superior reasoning wouldn't necessarily adopt the author's unproven teleological hypothesis.
So what would it say?
It might provide a much more nuanced response. Something like, your logical objection regarding the extreme triviality of the initial stages is valid. It challenges the efficacy of exaptation as a mechanism and highlights the extreme improbability requirements of genetic drift. This indicates that the current model, while empirically sound at a macro level, contains an internal logical inconsistency at the micro level of initiation.
So it would need to acknowledge the strength of the constraint. It would have to see the problem, even if it doesn't have the solution.
Exactly. This specific deep dive reveals a fascinating metric for AI maturity, then. It's not just about information access. It's about conquering specific, high-level logical challenges that require critical insight, the kind of insight that moves science forward by questioning its own assumptions.
The implication is profound. The author suggests that true scientific reasoning isn't just database correlation. It's the ability to apply rigorous logical constraints, like the extreme triviality of the NIB, and see how those constraints fundamentally break conventional models.
And if the author's projection is correct, this capacity for deep, constraint-aware reasoning will emerge as AI models gain what the author quantifies as higher IQ. This shows us that a deep philosophical debate on the nature of evolution is now tied directly to the computational evolution of our most advanced tools.
We have covered a huge amount of ground today. We've moved from the history of Darwinian thought through a precise logical trap centered on statistical probability and straight into the current limits of artificial intelligence logic. Let's try to briefly recap the core insights we've extracted from this deep dive.
Okay. First, I think we recognize the historical and philosophical ambiguity of that phrase, random mutation. We noted that the modern definition random with respect to fitness was, in part, a philosophical move to avoid teleology.
And this foundational uncertainty left a logical opening for the author's challenge.
Right. It showed us that even the scientific consensus that we all rely upon often contains these subtle, vulnerable philosophical underpinnings.
Second, we saw the compelling logical pressure posed by the wing test, and it was centered entirely on that initial scale and time scale, the extreme triviality of the nib in the first 100 years.
The argument established that this degree of triviality just negates the ability of conventional evolutionary mechanisms, like selection via exaptation, to drive the necessary sequential development. The statistical requirement for pure, undirected sequential progress proved to be a critical logical flaw in the randomness model.
And finally, we analyzed the limits of GPT-5's reasoning capacity. While the AI provided a highly sophisticated, technically correct response using all these advanced biological concepts,
Fitness randomness, exaptation, genetic drift.
it ultimately failed the test. And it failed because it could not adjust its comprehensive knowledge to the highly specific, counterintuitive scale constraint that was imposed by the thought experiment.
The author's speculative assessment is that this critical reasoning capacity currently exceeds the model's estimated 130 IQ.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider. If the most advanced AI currently available, operating on an estimated IQ of 130, fails to critically reason through the implications of temporal scale and evolution, a cornerstone scientific theory, what other widely accepted scientific facts, maybe across physics or medicine or cosmology, might also contain deep logical inconsistencies when they're subjected to equally rigorous novel scrutiny?
It's a great question. The test forces us to recognize the difference between comprehensive knowledge retrieval and genuine critical insight. The AI could perfectly synthesize the defense from its training data, but it lacked the singular insight required to spot the logical contradiction that was built into the problem's constraints.
Keep that distinction in mind as you navigate complex information going forward.
Absolutely.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us as we question the very foundation of evolution and the limits of modern AI logic.
Thank you for listening. We hope this has given you a rigorous new tool for questioning accepted ideas. We'll see you on the next deep dive.